Africa has politics that are constantly defined by the existence of dictatorships and terrorist organizations, and there are reasons that they occur there. So let's explore just some examples of it, and we can see how imperialism by European powers has impacted Africa. There are a number of dictators that have held power. You've got Robert Mugabe, Idi Amin, Yahya Jammeh, Sani Abacha, Haile Mariam, Isaias Afwerki, Jose Eduardo dos Santos, and I know none of those names probably mean anything to you, so that's why I'm going through this. You also have terrorist organizations. There's Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, the Islamic State group, Seychelles. Actually, you didn't realize it. Seychelles is just a fully sovereign nation. I just included it because you would totally believe whatever I told you with this project. So I'm specifically focusing on sub-Saharan Africa. Why sub-Saharan Africa and not North Africa and the Middle East, which similarly experienced the imperialism and are dealing with the side effects? Culturally, they are very different. Some of the details as to how things have happened have occurred differently, and I want to focus on the way that they've happened in sub-Saharan Africa. For our purposes, this is what I'm considering sub-Saharan Africa. Let's start off with Somalia. First of all, their federal government is completely ineffective as a result of their formerly being, surprise, a dictator. His name was Siad Barre. In the 90s, he was deposed, and the country kind of fell into disarray. They have the Al-Shabaab group. But an interesting thing about Somalia is that Somaliland is a region that effectively is its own country. They've been peaceful. They haven't had to deal with Al-Shabaab being a problem in that portion. They have a strong constitution. Their government functions. But no one calls them a country. And it's complicated. It has to do with the politics of the world, because the United Nations established the completely ineffective Somali government. Because that government holds the international recognition, no country wants to endanger their relationships with the Somali government by recognizing Somaliland, which Somalia claims as a region of it. And where there isn't Somaliland, there is, particularly in southern Somalia, especially around the capital of Mogadishu, you have Al-Shabaab. They're like most of the terrorist groups you find around the world. So how did this happen? This is a theme that we will see over and over again throughout this presentation. The decolonization efforts in Somalia were very rushed. Somalia formerly was known as the colony of British Somaliland, as well as Italian Somaliland. Somalia was one of the first places to gain independence. They fell into the Siad Barre dictatorship, and Siad Barre lost power. The new government was UN supported, and also doesn't work at all. So that's one example. This story is, for the most part, not unique to Somalia as far as sub-Saharan Africa. Now, we transition into another state. This one is in the modern day known as the Democratic Republic of the Congo. In the past, it has been known as Zaire. So, colonially, it was known as the Belgian Congo. And again, the Belgians liked to play favorites. The Democratic Republic of the Congo is a particularly ethnically diverse country. The Belgian Congo is a particularly ethnically diverse country, even for Africa. So, when the Belgians, under the United Nations decolonization plan, just packed themselves out of Africa, the groups that were left in Zaire couldn't agree on who to rule. Ultimately, a guy named Mobutu would be the ruler of Zaire, and he was, like a lot of the dictators in Africa, was deposed in the late 90s. And in that deposition, the country was renamed the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Again, extremely ethnically diverse. With Mobutu out, ethnic groups could not agree on a leader. So Laurent Désiré Kabila was able to walk right into the Democratic Republic of the Congo, say, hey, I can be your leader. Everyone said, okay. So the current president is his son because he died in 2001. But again, it was really, really rushed to form these states. These states do not follow ethnic maps whatsoever. If imperialism had not ended so rushed and haphazardly, the area currently known as the Democratic Republic of the Congo would likely be a much more stable area, at least within each of its constituent areas, as far as ethnic groups. Let's look back at a former British colony. We already talked about Somalia, which at some point had passed on to the Italians. Now let's look at Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone is different because Sierra Leone was largely stable throughout the 70s and 80s. It didn't have a dictatorship mostly to deal with. Like most African states, there were accusations of corruption because its ethnic groups don't like each other very much in Africa a lot of the time. But the 90s saw a huge civil war break out in Sierra Leone. And Sierra Leone's civil war, again, had much to do with ethnic relations in Sierra Leone. The president at the time was a guy named Ahmad Tijan Kaba, but the groups of people that did not like Kaba were led by a man named Johnny Paul Koroma. And ultimately, Sierra Leone devolved back into a sort of state of anarchy, much like what we're seeing in Somalia right now. In 2002, the war was eventually resolved. Sierra Leone is mostly peaceful. And again, I just want to go over a list of places where a lot of wars are currently happening right now. You've got Somalia, Sudan, Israel, Mozambique, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Central African Republic, Nigeria. And it's just the thing that you can find in common out of all of these places is that these were not countries that were decided on border-wise by the people. Sierra Leone was not decided on for existence by the people. It was decided by the British having it as a colony, and then being told by the United Nations, you need to get out of here, so they did. That leads over time to ethnic groups not liking each other, all wanting power in the same group. That formula doesn't work in Africa time and time again. But there is a place where people did decide on the borders. The people fought against the state that they were a part of, said, hey, we want to be separate from you. That country is called Eritrea. In the early 90s, they gained independence, and after a huge war with Ethiopia, they are the reason that Ethiopia no longer has a coastline. But again, Eritrea has a lot of ethnic groups that don't like each other. Eritrea has the Tigrinya. The Tigrinya are a very slight majority of the population of Eritrea. But Eritrea, having more than just the Tigrinya, with large populations in one place, they needed to cooperate to gain independence from the dictatorship that was occurring in Ethiopia. When Eritrea became independent, The ethnic group said, all right, sweet, we don't have Ethiopia. Now what do we do? The answer came by a guy named Isaias Afwerki, who has made Eritrea one of the most oppressive dictatorships in the world. On most of the world freedom rankings that I've found, Eritrea is last or next to last. So how could it happen with a group that decided they wanted to be independent from Ethiopia? They all fought for their independence, and they agreed that they should be independent. How did they still end up with a dictator? The answer is because Eritrean isn't an ethnicity. In France, people are French. Everyone knows that if you're living in France, you probably have French heritage. That's the case in Denmark. That's the case in most of the countries of the Eastern world, the old world, as history textbooks might refer to it. And in Africa, people identify with their ethnic group more so than with the state that they are part of. If the European powers had not established the concept of sovereign states the way that they did by saying, here, we're being told by the United Nations that we have to leave, let's go form a state here so that we don't get in international trouble. The concept of states in Africa would have been a much larger amount of states existing. Eritrea is the result of the European concept of statehood being overlaid on a geographical map of Africa as opposed to an ethnic map. If they had based the concept of statehood in Africa on an ethnic map, the region we know as Eritrea likely would have peace. Afwerki might have taken power in the Tigrinya-dominated area, but that's not a given. But European powers said, here, you can just kind of make a state out of a bunch of groups of people, which doesn't work. So Zimbabwe is another one. No, that's Zambia. This is Zimbabwe.
I can make you believe anything.
So they're currently led by a guy named Robert Mugabe. He took power in the 1970s as part of the old set of dictators in Africa. Mugabe overthrew what was then called the Rhodesian government, which was a white minority that controlled the area known as Zimbabwe today. So what has happened is through 40 years of rule by the same person, Zimbabwe has possibly the most hilarious inflation ever. So I actually went to the website of the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe to see if I could even find any reference to the currency existing. The currency was discontinued in the early 2010s, late 2000s, as a result of an exchange rate like $1 being several trillion Zimbabwe dollars. That is not economically viable if you want to have a state to be good at anything in the world. So Zimbabwe right now is mostly using US dollars. Looking at that Reserve Bank website, I found no references to the currency existing. They have exchange rates posted for US dollars to other types of currency that are commonly used, like the euro and whatnot. But the fact that their currency is such a national embarrassment that even their dictator, who is extremely nationalist, refuses to acknowledge the existence of a national currency tells you about how establishing these artificial states in Africa has led to such immense disorder. Zimbabwe has roughly 8 forms of currency that they use. It's because having a dictatorship established by a violent revolution because ethnic groups were being oppressed because the Europeans had established a government that did not represent the ethnic groups that lived in the region. It's all ties into the history of European conquest in Africa. So here's one final state that I'd like to go over. So this country is Uganda. And I'm not going to be focusing much on the dictator that they used to have in the 70s, because basically all you need to know, he idolized Hitler publicly. That tells you pretty much how his reign went. But one of the articles I found on Uganda was about how their recovery was going so well from the Idi Amin dictatorship under their new president, Yoweri Museveni. So in those first 10 years, Museveni was doing great things for Uganda. So Museveni made Uganda into a regional power in Africa. Uganda is doing pretty well for itself. Unfortunately, African nations are artificial, established by rapid European decolonization without much thought as to what the repercussions would be. So, Museveni decided, you know what, I don't need term limits or anything. I'm gonna keep power, and what's more, I'm gonna go help all the other people who want to keep power in their countries too. So, even when you get rid of a dictatorship in Africa, a new one rises. The new one might address some of the problems, just like it did in Uganda. Uganda, compared to the rest of the region it's located in, is doing really well for itself. Still dealing with the problems of a dictatorship. So to recap, what did European imperialism do in Africa? It caused ethnic tension, as we have seen in Rwanda and Sierra Leone. It has caused effective anarchy, which we have seen in Somalia. It has caused dictatorships. There's only a handful of island countries that have managed to do it and be pretty successful as far as political stability. But you have dictatorship, you have economic crises, you have ethnic tension, and you just have a state that isn't good to live in. Thank you.